Netherlands India Association organizes once every year. We are very glad having two most interesting and impressive speakers scheduled in our webinar. The first one will be Mr. Peter Gobetz, and the second one, but the most important one, will be Professor Mayank Varia. Peter Gobetz will be starting on the project of zero. You will ask yourself, what the hell do we do with the zero? I tell you, you cannot do without the zero. So Peter Gobetz, a long-time staff member of the Indian Embassy, an intellectual who has gotten, as media advisor also, who's got an enormous interest in the nothing, in the zero, which we cannot do without. And he is now going to enlighten us on this particular project. Peter.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, NIA, for the invitation to present the Zero project. To keep it as brief as possible and not to leave anything important out, I will read the text. I'm not that good at extemp. So let's start with some statistics to put the invention of zero into proper perspective. An estimated 500 million people worldwide practice yoga. And everybody knows that yoga comes from India. So yoga is India, India is yoga. The United Nations even instituted an International Day of Yoga recently, which is also observed in the Netherlands, as you know. But almost all 8 billion people in the world use the Indian decimal system plus zero every day in their lives, and they would be hard pressed to go a single day without. So that is why the Zero Project is lobbying in the Netherlands as well as in India to have a United Nations Day of Zero instituted as well. NIA can help by simply spreading the word. Zero is IT, IT is India. So what's so special about zero, you may ask? In a written endorsement by one of Holland's most renowned Indologists, Emeritus Professor Johannes Bronkhorst, on the launch of the Zero Project in 2016, said, open quotes, "Unfortunately, little is known about the origin of this digit. Strong indicators point to India, but research so far has done little beyond giving us some rough idea as to when the digit first came into use. If research sponsored by the Zero Origin India Foundation will shed light on this last question, not only Indologists, but our historians of mathematics will be grateful, understanding how and why great inventions were made that made modern science possible concerns all of mankind. And the invention of zero certainly ranks among the greatest, end of quote. After all, zero made possible the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the Information Age, the Space Age. Today, zero is everywhere embedded in our digital tools and toys. This very Zoom event is an unending stream of zeros and ones. So just think of the royalties that India could have collected if they had patented zero at the time. The invention and transmission of zero fostered constructive engagement over the centuries, and today has united people across the world via internet. Yet, despite India's greatest gift to the world, most people have no idea that the modern zero came from India. And so one of the objectives of the Zero Project, therefore, is to disseminate information about the invention of zero via print, electronic, social media to professionals, general public, and students at school and universities. But the main objective, and why we're here, of the Zero Project is to find fresh evidence of zero, of its invention, since it has still not been established when and where zero was invented. There are still claims and counterclaims from countries north, south, east, and west of India. That our modern zero came from India is not contested. Again, what is contested is whether India invented zero or whether zero had come to India from elsewhere, from Egypt, from Greece, from Babylon, from China, from Southeast Asia. We just don't know. Hence, there's still no proof positive that zero was invented in India, and so controversy persists in scholarly circles. To be fair to all parties and credible to the scientific community, it's crucial that all countries and regions are included in the research project, which would otherwise be dismissed as biased, and as such serve no purpose. So to that end, the Zero Project is compiling a monograph on zero, a book project to be published by Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Over 30 reputed academics and from practically all continents have contributed an article to the monograph, including a strong contingent from India. First and foremost, of course, Professor Vaya. These academics will present and discuss their papers during the online international conference, starting in October, in collaboration again with Vrije Universiteit. It will take place under the guidance of Professor Sharda Nandram, to whom we are, of course, most grateful for taking it up. Professor Nandram will also contribute a paper to the monograph on infinity in Indian thought, infinity, zero's twin. Art curator, Ms. Wende Wallerts, on learning of the Zero Project at the VU, decided to organize a zero exhibition for students and general public to coincide with our own online event and to be featured by us. We hope to welcome NIA members at the online event, as well as members of the Indian community in the Netherlands generally and the Indian diaspora beyond. As the event will be online, and the Zero Project enjoys support from, among others, UNESCO and from Dr. Robert Lawrence Kuhn in USA, producer-host of the popular PBS television series Closer to Truth, we do expect a large worldwide viewing audience. In that sense, the Zero Project presents a unique opportunity to unite the Indian community at home and abroad in a common cause that is both secular and politically non-partisan. The Zero Project also serves to strengthen India-Netherlands relations, since the Netherlands too played an important role in the overall zero story. Mathematician and inventor Mr. Simon Stevin, advisor to Prince Maurice, son of William of Orange, the father of the fatherland, popularized the decimal system among scholars, tradesmen, and common folk. The Netherlands soon officially adopted the decimal system and zero in the 17th century. And after that, followed by the rest of Europe, mainly again, thanks to the efforts of Simon Stevin. The awkward Roman numerals were left behind forever. And yet, to this day, the Western calendar adopted across the world has no year zero. Rather, the Western calendar starts at year one. A stark reminder that zero from India reached the West very late in the game, some almost 1,000 years after its first use in India. 1,000 years. The present Gregorian calendar dates from 1582, several centuries after zero had reached Europe. And still, even then, zero was not incorporated in the Western calendar that's being used worldwide today, ironically, including in India. So this year should be 2020 and not 2021. So I'm happy to say that you are all a year younger than you thought when you logged on this afternoon, thanks to zero. Okay, so, but seriously, zero was India's most important export product ever. And its impact is felt across the world still. The very word zero is derived from the Sanskrit word shunya. So high time we finally establish the facts about the invention of zero and to learn if zero holds more secrets for us. Perhaps some of you may have heard of the famous incident involving the 80,000-ton United States warship, the Yorktown. In September of 1997, this missile cruiser, armed to the teeth, while on maneuvers, stopped dead in the water You guessed it. New software controlling the engines had been installed, but engineers overlooked a zero and neglected to remove it. Science author Mr. Charles Seif, in his popular book on zero, recounts the story, open quotes. No other number can do such damage, he says. Cultures girded themselves against zero and philosophies crumbled under its influence, for zero is different from all other numbers. This is the story of zero, he writes. From its birth in the East, its struggle for acceptance in Europe, its ascendancy in the West, and its ever-present threat to modern physics. Mayank knows about that. Zero is powerful because zero is infinity's twin. Humanity could never force zero into its philosophies. Instead, zero shaped humanity's view of the universe. End of quote. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I look forward to hearing Professor Mayank Vaya talk about an exciting journey that he took across the world with zero as his reliable compass. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, indeed, for your contribution. It's interesting to see that something can be an export product without you so surely having invented something. So Indians are very strong in many things, and this is again one of those. So we are still searching for the origin of the invention of the zero. After Peter, we have Professor Vahia, and then I will give the floor to Suman, if you allow me, Suman. We had the intellectual Peter, and we have now the intellectual scientist, Professor Vahia. He was with the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and Tata is a name which we always very well known all over the world, and which is also very much known in the Netherlands as well. And your astrophysica and your astrophysical interest and knowledge is, how would I say, proverbial, Professor Vahia. And we are very glad that from your very, very high travels, I would say, going to the moon, of letting things go to the moon and in the International Space Station, that you have been willing to come down again to the Earth to talk about the zero. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank the Society for giving me this opportunity to talk about what Peter and I have been sort of thinking about and working on. A lot of what I will say is as much thanks to Peter as anybody else. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I hope I will convey to you the excitement of this idea of zero. To do that, of course, I will use some slides. I've got about 20 slides. And just as we were sort of introducing and talking, I thought adding this much ado about nothing to my title would be an interesting addition. So we are going to talk about this odd entity called zero. And zero is a very strange entity, as all of us will agree. It means null in value. And for example, in a number called 302 or something, you would expand it as per powers, and then you would show that zero is in tens place, there is no zero and all that. And this is a very instinctive and a very natural way of doing things. And there is no, and this is something that has been used by humanity probably from the first civilizations on the banks of Euphrates and Tigris. So Sumerians, Mesopotamians were probably the first ones from whom we have a clear evidence of using zero as a place value. They used it in a variety of, they had variety of symbols for it, they had a variety of stories for it, but I don't want to get into that. The bottom line is that the first introduction to zero to all of us is a very straightforward entry and something that you would follow without too much difficulty. The problem comes when you expand that idea to other areas of science. Is there zero in physics? Is there zero in religion? Is there zero in philosophy? Is there zero in, how does advanced mathematics play out in the presence of zero? Is there something called zero of a grammar? And that is when things start becoming uncomfortable. That is when things start becoming difficult. And that is when people start feeling uncomfortable in many ways justifiably, because it is a very strange entity. And different cultures as a whole have reacted differently to this very idea of an entity that has no physical value. Wherever you put zero, units don't matter, quantities don't matter, what you are talking about doesn't matter. It is null, it is blank, it is zero, it is nil, whichever way you want to put it. And then you find yourself at a dead end of various things. And that has been such a strange discussion stopper or idea stopper that many cultures have flinched from taking it head on. And that is where the story of zero becomes so much more interesting. So essentially, even if you look at the history of arithmetic and mathematics in many of these cultures, many have circumvented the very idea of zero even in their mathematics and gone on to do some good algebra, but not use not use the idea of zero or not play with zero at all. So they would take these multiple equations and solve them together, etc., but not face up to zero at all. So that was something very peculiar. Even Chinese, for example, did some good mathematics. Egyptians did some good mathematics. Babylonians, of course, are famous for their various tables of mathematics, but they circumvented zero by underplaying its context. The nullness of zero is something that would not strike them, and they just used it as a number system. Today, we will discuss the difference in attitude between Europe and India, and show how strange reactions can be. Um, if you look at the proximity of Latin and Sanskrit, this has been established long back that the Indo-Europeans had a common area origin somewhere in Central Asia, and from Central Asia, as the group separated, one went to Europe and the other one went to India and set up their respective cultures. But the original root language of both these cultures remain the same, and that's why Indo-European becomes a single word. And yet, Indo-European ideas in zero in particular, the reaction to zero is dramatically different. So about 25,000 years ago, when the early Indo-Europeans must have separated from Europe, from Central Asia, they carried some common beliefs. So the very idea of Mother Earth and being seeded by Father Sky and creating life is something that is very old. In fact, it is so old that even we believe that Neanderthals had somewhat similar belief. So Mother Earth, Father Sky, and the basic idea of religion and basic idea of philosophy actually must have been there even as the Indo-European separated out in Central Asia. Obviously, Latin and Sanskrit suggest that they had a common Indo-European language, which must have been fairly sophisticated because people have tried to create the original Indo-European language, and you can express fairly sophisticated ideas in that. But slowly, as the culture separated, they formed their worldview, which was very different. So, for example, the group that came to India saw this landscape as their very common landscape. This is a classical picture from, or rather, an average picture from Central Asia. This particular picture is from Kazakhstan. But long, featureless, blank landscapes is what marks out the landscape of Central Asia, where you could see all the way to the edge of the horizon as if it was a sea, without seeing any feature, without seeing any structure. And the idea of blankness is something that catches you. And if you ever get a chance to go to, say, Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, you can experience the nullness of nature, because it is dry, it is cold, it is featureless, and it is growthless. The idea of nullness cannot help but strike you very hard. On the other hand, those who went to Europe saw a landscape like this: warm, green, lush, with lots of cycles of growth and death and rejuvenation, and a winter that seemed to still everything, and a summer that seems to rejuvenate everything within a matter of days and all that. There were a lot of exciting things that happened. So the way in which you would look at nature, if you were in Central Asia or the kind of landscapes that are on the left, you would naturally react very differently than if you were in a landscape which is there on the right. The left landscape also meant that settling down was a difficult idea, a difficult exercise, because you could never rely on ground on the local vegetation to provide you enough resources for a long time to come. So mobility was a part of the story of people who lived on landscapes in the Central Asian region than in Europe, which was much more hospitable to life. And that difference, according to me, shows up in this issue of zero. There were very important divergences between Europe and Indians thereafter. So Indian essentially had a religion with no permanent placement, no permanent location, and they would perform their worships and move on. And essentially, it was of people who are nomadic in lifestyle, and in a landscape which encouraged you to think about null. So Indians incorporated null in their in their ideas and philosophy very quickly. Because the Vedic Indians had no permanent place of worship, they also did not have any rooted place in which to stay, and therefore this idea of permanence comes to much India much later. If you look at the early philosophical transcripts of India, the Rig Veda and stuff like that, you would see that their god also is a formless structure, which is worshipped through fire. So fire is the only medium through which people worship, and fire is the carrier of messages. And there are elaborate ideas about what kind of fires are there and all that. But the basic structure of God is formless. And along with that came ancestor worship, which is another abstraction. So the religion they developed was a tripartite relation between humans, gods, and ancestors, and each had to keep the other two happy in order to survive in life. So the very perspective of religion that was there was very difficult. Compared to that with, for example, Greek religious ideas, which are so much more in ferment, so much more in individual entities and relations between individuals and so on. Um, Indian religion tended to be more formless and abstract. But the Europeans had an idea that God created the universe and he was the one without whom life was unimaginable. This became a very root idea in Europe, which was not there in India, for example. So one became the natural smallest number for Europe because one would be everywhere. Even if there was nothing that they could imagine, a complete vacuum, the God who created the world would be there, and therefore one was the smallest number that existed. Zero made them literally uncomfortable, and we'll briefly come to that a little later. But on the other hand, Indians, like I said, were very comfortable with this idea of visualizing a non-existent entity. To them, it represented an amorphous, unidentified entity that could be experienced in absence. So if you look at the practice of meditation at that level, the idea is not so much to think about things, the idea is not so much to read and create, but to meditate and blank out your thoughts so that the non-thought experiences become primary in life. The null entity that represented something that did not exist or had ceased to exist is something that they did not find uncomfortable at all. And there was an interesting idea that came up in a variety of contexts. This idea of nullness then started to prevail all kinds of things. And we look at some of these things in very quickly. So all cultures, like I said, believed in the great God who created everything. He was the proverbial one who always was present when even nothing was present. So there was no vacuum as far as Europe was concerned. On the other hand, the great God then created the universe and many variations in life and so on, and one therefore pervaded everywhere in the universe. This is typically the first line of human pursuit when understanding creation. So there is this Mother Earth, Father Sky. The Father Sky sees Mother Earth, and Mother Earth gives life and all that. But essentially, this idea of one pervading superpower was always explicit within the structure of philosophical thought. For the Indians, on the other hand, the sheer experience of blankness of Central Asia told them that you could begin from null, and that null began to prevail. So if you look at, for example, one of the most recited verses from Rig Veda, it's called Nasadiya Suktam. It begins by saying that at first there was neither being nor being. There was air, nor air, there was not air not sky beyond. And the question that poet asks is, what was wrapping, where and whose protection? Was water the unfathomable deep? And the poet says there was no death, and yet deathlessness. Of night and day there was not any sign. One breathed without a breath by his own impulse. Other than that, nothing else. There was nothing else at all. Then the poet goes. So it's a long poem of 10 verses. Then the poet goes on to ask as to who really knows, who can presume to tell, when was it born, when was the issue created. So somewhere in between there is a verse which says that out of nothingness an entity emerged, the God emerged who through his ardor and love for creation created the rest of the universe. And that is how he creates the universe. So, but the poet still continues to who really knows and who can presume to tell. And then they come up with this idea that even gods came after the emergence. So, who can tell about the emergence? Then, in the last seventh verse, the poet says, maybe he who resides in the highest heaven, surely he knows. But then the poet still has a doubt that maybe even he doesn't know. The very idea that not knowability is a perfectly valid piece of knowledge is a very strange philosophical approach of the Indians. So Indians then started entering this idea of nullness a lot of places. Nasadiya Sukta that I just quoted is one place. Then in meditation, for example, the idea is not to study about or read about or to listen to teachers, but to meditate and to blank out your mind, to bring a state of nullness where your inner instincts would tell you much more about the universe than any learning could tell you. The very profound idea of meditation is absence of thought and not thought. Then some Indians had other problems. They were nomadic. They had various ideas which need to be transmitted, and they didn't want to write them down because written medium was transient. And so they needed to create a language where they could easily transmit ideas over generations, over thousands of years, and over millions of kilometers of landscape without loss of information. The mode that they chose was to choose the mode of poetic language, and the language that they chose is called Sanskrit. It is a close relative of Latin, but it is highly compactified in the sense. Most of the writing is in the form of verses, which means that you cannot easily lose or put in a false word in place of a correct word because the rhyme and rhythm will not set. If in a poetry, it is very difficult to change words without losing the entity of poem. So poem is one way of ensuring that, or verses is one way of ensuring that the knowledge is transmitted. Then there are various rules of grammar which are incorporated in order to make this poetry efficient and not very verbose and yet very informative. So all kinds of grammatical structures are created in many of these skipped pronunciations, skipped words, skipped relations, etc., are a very common feature of that language. So you have to essentially, if you read a word, the word may mean much less than what it is supposed to imply. And by properly looking at the grammar of that word, you could dissect it and find out what it is. Um, there are several examples, there are several beautiful examples of how a word means much less if you are not fully well versed with it than what it would mean if you are fully well versed with it, because the grammar was highly compacted, and missing out or hiding words or hiding relations was something very common to that, and that is what gave a major fillip to the idea of being using null in life. Then there are many of the chants which are essentially meaning of wordless rhymes. You see in them words which have no meaning at all in any dictionary, but they are critical to completing a particular religious ritual. So the idea that you could sort of talk to gods or create your religious processes without having to refer to words with meaning is another idea of nullness that comes. Because the god is in null, the chanting is sufficient. Even if in a wordless chanting has a lot of significance and meaning, because gods can be talked to in a variety of manner, and using this wordless rhythms was a crucial part of that story. Then as people became more sophisticated, they were wondering about life, and there's a very nice textbook of physics or science, if you wish, called Vaisheshika. And that the sort of science, the person who wrote that book starts worrying about what life is. So in order to incorporate botany, he calls life, but then he realizes that life as plant and life as animals is very different. So he invokes this idea of mana and atma, and then he goes on to develop the whole theory of existence. And there again, atma is supposed to be another featureless entity, because your original god was featureless. Now your ultimate death was also featureless, where you went and merged from one featureless entity to another featureless entity. So this idea of nullness became a very prevalent idea and a very very casually used idea in a variety of contexts. Similarly, even the same Vaisheshika, when it talks about the smallest entity of the universe, talks about Anu, which has now been in 20th century translated into atom, but it really is a very fundamentally different entity, again, which itself is formless and propertyless. So the idea of zero, the idea of null is a very common idea to humans. And in fact, when Peter first talked to me about zero, I was quite surprised because in an Indian cultural environment, this blankness is such a normal thing that you don't realize that it is a strange concept at all. It takes you some time to realize how strange that concept is. Then in algebra, and the reason why India gets credit for the invention of zero is because of the work of Brahmagupta, in the sense that till then algebra was being done by others also. Chinese did some algebra, even Egyptians did some algebra, but they circumvented zero, and they didn't face up to zero upfront because it was a strange entity which they couldn't make sense of. Brahmagupta was the first one, 475 AD, stands up and says, wait a minute, zero is an important entity and we need to define operations for zero. He got some things right, he got some things wrong. Most of what he did was right, but in issues like zero upon zero division, etc., he got it, it had to be subsequently corrected because his definition of zero upon zero was zero, which is not strictly accurate. But most of the rules of handling numbers with zero, zero into any number is zero, zero upon any number is zero, and so on, essentially comes from Brahmagupta 475 AD. And that is where a whole new field of algebra opens up and a whole new field of approach comes up, and eventually that would lead to major developments in mathematics the world over. So it is not that Indians were the first one to use numbers, a zero in a location in the placement based value system, but it was because they faced up to zero and looked at the algebra of zero, which changed mathematics forever and applications of mathematics into science forever. As it was mentioned in the introduction, zero starts with shunya, becomes sifar in Arabic, and eventually becomes zero in Europe. So Indians were the first one to look at the algebra of zero and open the window to a completely new class of mathematics, which became then critical to other developments in science. And that's why the credit comes to India. So Brahmagupta in, sorry, not 475, 628 AD was the first one to worry about zero as a number, and he took zero seriously for the first time. And he eventually students of equations enhance this value of a zero by defining what is called zero of an equation. When does the value of an equation become zero and all that? And soon people began to realize and appreciate the value of zero. So Indians did not invent zero in that sense of the word, but they were the first ones to understand it and the first ones to explain it and the first one to use it as a matter of routine in their algebraic work. They did not skirt around zero. They faced up zero for what it was worth. And soon it became very clear that it has very profound implications. Europe resisted the idea of zero because there could not be null. The one was everywhere. And so Europe had a lot of resistance to zero. So in early Europe, for example, it was actually forbidden to teach algebra even in 10th century AD and so on, because zero was considered unnatural and against the working of the great one who was always present. So zero and its conjugate, the infinity, was also something that was not taught. Fibonacci was the first one who actually learned his mathematics from the Muslims and went on to use Arabic numerals. So he also calls them Arabic numerals, while Arab texts themselves are very clear that these are Indian numerals. But anyway, that's another story. But in 1202, Fibonacci comes back to Europe and says that, look, this using the algebra of the kind that Arabs have been using is phenomenally more powerful than the kind of algebraic trickeries, etc., that we do in Europe. The book showed how the Arabic numerals were for doing some complex calculations, and the Italian merchants and bankers quickly seized upon this system and started including zero and started doing calculations for their banking system using this Arabic method of Arabic method of calculation, which essentially was derived directly from the Indians. Um, it was eventually that the governments relented and allowed teaching of zero in routine course of mathematics under commercial pressure. But even then, even today, Europe tends to be more resistant to the idea of including zero than they would be. So, for example, a black hole is considered a singularity rather than a 0 point, when in fact in rationality it should be called a 0 point. But the idea of calling a zero still makes Europe uncomfortable. The Arabic notion was allowed into Italy soon and spread to Europe, and so zero arrived around 1400 AD to Europe in real sense of the word. So the Aristotelian wall against zero and infinity eventually crumbled because of the influence of the Muslims and the Hindus in the 14th century AD, and even the staunchest supporter of Aristotelianism eventually gave way to allowing zero in 14th century AD. So 625 is when Arya 625 I think is when Indians do the algebra of zero. It takes 1400 years before it is accepted in Europe. And even today, like I said, there are examples where a European mathematics would rather use the idea of singularity of singleton rather than null as a concept for non-arithmetic, non-mathematical structures. But zero itself is a very prevalent one. So let me quickly run through those ideas. In religion and philosophy, for example, the great creator, at least in Indian mind, is essentially self-create. From nowhere, it is Swayambhu is a word. From nowhere does he make an appearance of himself, and from his own appearance, he then creates the rest of the world. So the idea of zero starts with religion and philosophy in India. Meditation and Buddhist concepts of nirvana and so on all add up to this complexity of the idea of null, focus on null rather than reality. In grammar, the disappearance of words, the disappearance of pronunciation, the alterations of pronunciation, and there are some 6 or 7 ways in which pronunciations are altered in order to make the language more compact and more useful. In mathematics, of course, zero is a useful number. Babylonians started with it, but then the real algebra of zero begins only once we have a good idea of what zero, how to handle zero in mathematics, something that other cultures had circumvented for the sheer confusion of what this entity of that. Eventually, physics has also come around to seeing some complete zeros which just cannot be avoided. The most beautiful example is that there is the temperature of minus 273 degrees settled in is an absolute zero. There is no such thing as negative Kelvin temperature because everything freezes and everything stops at minus 273 degrees centigrade. Similarly, the light unit, the agent that carries light around, photon, has to have absolutely zero mass, because even if you put an infinitesimally small mass, the entire stability of the universe blows up. It has to be zero and has to remain zero. Similarly, there are other entities like charge of neutrino, etc., where physics has just not been able to avoid an absolute zero as a value. There is no incremental value, there is no experimental error, there is no approximation involved in defining several entities as zeros. Computers, of course, rely on zeros and ones, and again, we had discussed this at the introduction, that zeros and ones are the numbers which make the binary code on which the computers work. And so there is one obvious way of using computers, but zero is also in many ways debased by computers. Computer registers begin with zero, so they respect zero as the first number, and then 1 2 3 4 are the registers. Zero is the first register. They give due respect to zero as the first entity for counting anything, but at the same time they have also debased zero in many ways, in the sense that 0345 is a perfect T-pin number, or 0789 can be your card number, and so on, while in fact a leading zero in mathematics makes no sense. So if you type, for example, in an Excel sheet 0725, it will write it as 725 because leading zeros make no sense. But in passwords, in computer labeling, in computer addressing, etc., that leading zero makes sense. It has in many ways debased zero, and in many ways also acknowledged the greatness of zero. So zero in computers itself is a very fascinating multi-purpose use. Now you can do much more to this than just talk about individual stories. These individual stories, individual examples, individual categories, and use of this zero in individual entities itself is a fascinating story. But you can do something more which is more revealing. And what you can do is that you can list out zeros and they're in various entities. You can then worry about their interrelations. What I mean is this. So you have basic religions, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and so on. And then you have various philosophical ideas of existential zero, Jain metaphysical zero, formless God. You have meditation, then you have grammar and various entities, then you have music, everywhere where zero makes an appearance one way or the other. And then you can worry about correlations. So, for example, how well is Jainism and Hinduism connected? And you can put quantifiable numbers to this. So you can talk about relation between Hinduism and Jainism, Jainism and Buddhism, and all the cross correlations, and philosophical ideas with religious ideas and so on. And then go back and ask the computer that how does this thing work, and then you get an interesting graph. So you get this network graph where you have network of connectivity of ideas between various things. So you obviously find that the religious ideas have a degree of connectivity in themselves because they all have this idea of a great God, um, and um, and essentially the need for behaving in the best interest of civilization. Now, the basic philosophical ideas of religion show that religion becomes one single unit. Similarly, grammatical ideas and the use of grammar in various structure comes out to be a single unit. Even metaphysical zeros of Buddhism and existential, etc., relation turn out to be well correlated. Um, uh, Absolute zeros of physics, like I said, absolute zeros and relative zeros of physics, science tend to be correlated. Then zeros of physics and metaphysical zeros tend to get connected, and all of them, quite interestingly, connect to each other through music, through formless God, and the idea of meditation. So that seems to provide link between what we think are completely separate set of zeros in physical sciences to completely different set of zeros in philosophy, religion, and grammar. Music provides an interesting link. You can also go back to the computer and give the same data that I showed earlier and say how are entities connected, and then computer comes out with an algorithm with a check which says that Euro-Asian religions, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam seem to have an internal collectivity, which is slightly different from what the Indic religions suggest. So Indic religions of Buddhism, Jainism, etc., and their own preoccupation with nihilism and nullness and so on, tend to make another group of entities. Then, of course, mathematical and physical zeros make their own entity. And then these great zero of music and grammar seem to provide a connectivity and link between the two. So somewhere in this vast sea of zero and its knowledge, there is a connection between all of them. And if you quantify those relay connections and look at them a little more in detail, the music, everything from chants which are blank to the very idea of music, which is natural rhythmic relation, which is self-absorbing and self-focusing, seems to somehow give us an experience where we experience not only the religious zero or philosophical zero, but also physical zeros and their entities seem to get connected, providing a very nice link between various forms of zero and allowing us to experience various forms of zero, whether we are conscious about them or not. And that is where the beauty of zero comes in. That is where the beauty of the very idea of zero comes in. That is why this idea of identifying credits, etc., comes in, not because we want to glorify one civilization against another, but we want to know why, and we want to know how, and we want to know why others missed it, why did they bypass it, and why did Indians accept it, and what did they do with it, and where does this connection lead to. And that is where the Zero Origin India comes in, with a variety of questions about this relation of zeros, the ideas of zeros, the evaluation of zeros, the reason for avoiding zeros, the reason for facing up to zeros, the odd comfort with zero that Indians experience right from their childhood. And in fact, when they are told about zero as being important, they actually find it a strange entity because it's been a part of their daily experience for so long in various aspects that they see nothing strange in that. So there is a whole culture that finds nothing strange in something that is obviously very strange. And that, of course, comes from conditioning. The bottom line is that science prides itself in cultural independent and absolute, but cultural sensitivities play a lot of role in giving new insights to various ideas. Europeans did not like zeros and Indian did not like axiomatic approach. So Indian inductive approach produced its own new insights into zero, while Indians would never have been able to produce the insights into technology and science that axiomatic approach of Europeans did. So no particular culture is superior to another culture, but the very difference in their perspective and approach means that they will take science to different paths and different ideas and different insights. And it is only by appreciating this cross-cultural links and the idea of science and and the idea of perspective that will take us forward. Well, so while rationality and experimental confirmation are the final arbiters of sciences, the perspective can vary, and as the perspective varies with cultural background, the ideas and perspectives that you will bring in will also vary with time. Uniqueness produces unique perspectives, and we need to appreciate that, and we need to find out how this works and how this happens. And that is why Zero Origin India project of Peter is so much so important and needs to be seriously looked at, because there is something strange about cultural influences of science. People have studied them in a very shallow manner, in the contrast of whether there are more Muslim scientists or whether there are more black scientists or whether there are more women scientists, etc. But there is something really profound about ideology, about the perspective and cultural identity of an individual and the way he or she brings in ideas into science. So, for example, I have this beautiful example of Carlo Rubbia, Nobel laureate and head of CERN, who once told me that when he's looking for a PhD students, he has a very clear criterion. If the problem requires a lot of physical labor and a lot of hard work in a disciplined manner, he prefers to take a Chinese student for his PhD. But if he has a problem which requires a lot of thinking, intricate logical working, and intricately solving various problems, he prefers an Indian students, because Indian students are so used to handling ideas and playing with ideas that they are much better at deeper thinking. But if you ask them to take an instrument which has to be sort of closed and opened 3 times with enormous labors, they will get tired very quickly and leave the project. So even today in 20th century, 21st century sciences, this cultural baggage that all of us carry make us what we are. And as a whole, if we are to do well, we have to look at each of these perspectives together, appreciate its value and its roots in order that we do well. Thank you very much. And once again, I want to thank Peter for a lot of ideas that have been put into this talk. I will stop my sharing and I'll be happy to
Oh,
answer the question.
oh, thank you very much, Professor Mang, for such a great knowledge about zero. My God, I really my hats off to you and
Thank you.
compliment.
Thank
Even
you very
people
much.
are know zero, but don't know what's the value of the zero, how to need the zero. Today
Thank you.
we know about it, and thankful to you. And now open a floor to all my guests or members if they want to ask any question to Mr. Professor Mike Bahaya. Anybody has any question, please raise a hand and he ready to any answer to you. Madam Mariam Mott, anything you have to ask Professor Mike?
I don't know if I could add anything because it was such a good overview of all the uh, uh, the essence, you might say, of zero. And it would take a little bit more thinking on my part to even ask a good question. But I'm very happy that we're going to have this conference coming up. And I certainly intend to take part in it in some way, as a listener mostly. But of course, having learned Sanskrit and reading the Vedas, and I'm not really any more European. And even though I was born in the United States, but I'm not even a European, essentially. But I really enjoyed this afternoon. quite, and it's brought up more questions in my mind than answers. And I think that I would like to thank you, Dr. Vahimya.
Very kind of you.
Thank
Very
you,
kind.
Madam President. And I, Mr. Roloff, want to ask some question. Please, Mr. Roloff, go ahead.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you so much to presenters for a brilliant and an erudite presentation. It's just, it's mind-boggling, truly. The question I have is, it was alluded to earlier, the link between 0 and infinity. And I'm asking that because my own spiritual teacher, Adidas Samraj, has actually 5 pages of description of how he views this. I'd be happy to share it with you if that is of any use. But what is what's the link between 0 and infinity?
Okay. From purely mathematical point of view, the reciprocal of 0 is infinity. So 1 upon 0 is infinity essentially in mathematics. But the idea of an open infinite universe beginning with 0 is very Indian, in the sense that Greeks tried very hard. Once they got idea of this geometry, when they had the idea of closed geometry, they worked very hard, for example, to put planetary orbits into the 5 platonic solids and so on. And they wanted to conserve entities and within a closed set. On the other hand, from very early, so for example, there is a competition actually in early Indian literature about what is the biggest number you can think of. And the first one starts with 10 raised to 9, then they go to 10 raised to 12 and 10 raised to 17 and so on, to see how big a number you can imagine in which context. And again, that is, in some competition, it is silly, it is funny, but the very idea has to be not to be scared of large numbers. So for example, when Indians did arithmetic, they didn't have these decimal systems. So they would expand the numbers to integers. So you have these divisions of enormously large numbers dividing another set of large numbers, because they did not have this decimal notation presentation. That comes much later. But that did not make them uncomfortable, is where the interesting entity is. That large numbers were perfectly fine with them. And the larger you got, the better, more macho you were, as it were. Yes,
fantastic.
Thank
you very much for the wonderful answer, Mr. Vahia. Thank you.
Sir.
Anyone more, please, forward to come?
Dr. Eric wants to say something. Yes, sir.
I think either to you, Professor, or to Peter Gobetz. We had the relationship between 0 and infinity. I have a much simpler relationship, which perhaps you can say something about, which is the relationship between the 0 and the 1.
Yes. Yes. 0 and 1 are, yes. The very fact that there can be infinite numbers between 0 and 1 is so scary. Okay. It is a phenomenally scary realization. That there are kinds of infinities that eventually arithmetic would come. There will be countable infinities, there will be uncountable infinities, there are unmappable infinities. There are a variety of kinds of infinities that can be worked on. And each of them has its own set of fascination. So if you say that I have a set of numbers, all numbers less than 1 and greater than 0, it is essentially an infinite set. Because you can have so many fittings inside that it is quite unnerving. And then all the numbers need not even be 1 upon 2. Root 2, for example, would be a perfectly interesting number to have, which is not even rational. So the number systems, once they take off, are a fascinating story on their own. But Peter will kill me if I try to start talking about them.
May I ask something?
Yeah.
So I was finally able to join, so I have missed at least a portion of your, I think you were showing some slides. So I was wondering 2 things, if you could get those slides, because then
sure.
that would be fantastic. And the other thing is, as Mariana just pointed out, it adds to confusion.
It does.
It's just so deep, like you said, the relationship between 0 and 1, and then infinity, and when do you start counting, and it comes out of nothing. So I will really have to read those slides in order to get a little bit
I will be very happy to share my slides. Yeah, this was my first slide. I think you saw. Did you see this?
Yeah, that it was strange. Yeah, that I noticed.
Yeah, so that is my first slide.
Yeah.
Before that was only a title slide.
Yeah, and as Peter pointed out, so it's not much ado about nothing, or maybe Shakespeare was a very wise man at his time. It's much to do about nothing.
Yes, yes.
So yeah, very interesting. That online webinar, which will be coming up in October, sounds really, really very interesting and very deep also. Yeah, very, thank you for, I haven't heard all of it, but it sounds so interesting.
Thank you.
Uh,
Thank you
But
very much.
Sumit, you can also follow on YouTube later on. Pankaj, you go to put on YouTube.
Yeah.
You can see everything, but we have discussed here.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Suman, if I may jump in,
Yeah.
you mentioned Shakespeare
Yeah.
and much to do about nothing. There's a book about zero written by a American professor named Brian Rothman,
Yeah.
and he focuses on a number of issues related to the introduction of zero in Europe. And one of them is that that Shakespeare was among the first schoolboys. Shakespeare was among the first schoolboys in England who was being taught the then new decimal system plus zero. And so before that, zero, like was Professor Mayank was explaining, was being shunned in Europe, and it slowly gained ground. And so by the time Shakespeare is there in the 16th century, it's finally being taught in schools. And so these schoolboys were exposed to this new idea of nothingness. And Shakespeare has written an untold number of plays in which the concept of nothing plays a central role, especially in King Lear, if you get a chance to look at it. So this is interesting to see how a new idea came in from the East and who it's slowly being absorbed in Europe. And this is also the time when Europe was moving from the Dark Ages to the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And my own feeling is, it has to be proven that European Renaissance owes a lot to the influx of these new ideas from the Muslim world and from India. So zero, I mean, nothingness. Suddenly we're playing all these wordplay jokes, but it has a very serious undertone if you want to delve into it. So it's
yes, it was a serious undertone, and it's about concepts which you cannot. You can define them, but you cannot measure them. It's about emptiness. It's about nothing. Nothing is everything. It's full and infinity. And it's interesting to see also how the relation is between, the origins of zero and the concept of zero, nothingness. And then in computer languages, in digital, you use zeros and ones to communicate. That relationship is also interesting to see.
Yeah. By the way, talking of Newton having learned zero, Newton would have really missed out on a lot of his work if he had not been introduced to zero. His very idea of this limiting values to defining speed, velocities, and eventually went on to develop differential algebra, which is crucially dependent on entities which are very, very close to zero, but not quite zero.
Yeah.
And that changed a lot of physics. He completely introduces the idea of speed. How do you measure speed? It is distance traveled in a certain amount of time. But if you want instantaneous speed, it is in the minimal of time, nearly zero time, you measure the speed. And that led eventually to the idea of differential algebra, which would play a crucial role in developing a lot of technology and sciences. So if Newton had not been introduced to this idea of zero in school, you would have been seriously poorly off.
Very true. Fantastic. And thank you very much. And ask your test to Mr. Dr. Professor Victor von Weiler. Any question? Mr. Victor?
Yeah, I was wondering, you mentioned the concept of zero as shunya.
Yes.
Could you give any, perhaps, are there any other Indian terms for the concept of zero? I mean, it sounds, the word shunya is of course very well known from particular Mahayana philosophies.
Yes.
Even in Pali, I think you have it as sunya. But I was wondering, are there other terms for this, for zero as a number or as a concept, except?
Well, as a concept, it is there. So, for example, when Sanskrit grammar is written, Panini does not write zero. He does not call it shunya. He calls it lopa or disappearance, non-existence. Okay, so he uses that concept of non-existence of a particular phrase as an equivalent of zero. Similarly, in chants, etc., there is no explicit saying that I'm giving you zero ideas, but I'm just giving you a rhythm. It is implicitly taken into it. So at other uses of zeros other than formal mathematical sense, zero has a variety of formats. So nothing is I don't know the exact Sanskrit translation of the word nothing in Nasadiya Sukta, but that would be another place where zero is used without without calling it shunya. But if you give me 10-20 seconds, I'll try and find out what the exact Sanskrit word in Nasadiya Sukta is. But that's a good question. I don't know of an answer. Give me a second. I have the Nasadiya Sukta on my machine.
Mayank, if I
Yes.
may, Mayank,
Yes.
if I may, I think
Yeah.
maybe what Victor meant, I don't know if he meant that exactly, but there are other words that were used for shunya, for zero before shunya, like ka and all those kind of words. Do you know them by heart? Ambara?
I don't know them by heart.
Zero was actually rather late as in mathematics. Before that, it was used. There were other words were used like ka for space, and umbra and words like that.
Yeah, I found it very interesting that you mentioned actually that zero and infinity, at least in the concept of space, as far as I know from ancient Indian philosophy, it was considered to be infinite, ananta, which the Greeks, of course, never had that idea.
So,
I mean, that's quite remarkable.
Yes, sir. Yeah. And I just checked, Nasadiya Sukta actually avoids using the word zero. It says it was neither this nor that, and lists out a whole bunch of complementary entities saying it is neither this nor that. So it's more like in the form of neti that it describes.
Yeah, it was probably nasad na asad.
Yeah, nasad,
neither being nor non-being.
Correct. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So shunya, like Peter said, comes later. Yes, sir.
It is very nice. I think our time is also over. It's exactly 6 o'clock. That the meeting today 1 hour. And if anybody want to come forward, Mr. Pankaj or anybody else, please, to ask any question, please, Mr. Pankaj.
From my side.
All right. So I would like to thanks to Mr. Peter Goberts to help us to introduce Dr. Professor Mayank Vahia to give us such a wonderful knowledge to us. And we are really today in Netherlands Indian Association very honored to have two great person in our event. And once again, Mr. Peter Goberts, thank you. Without you, this not be possible to happen. And Mr. Dr. Professor Mayank Vahia, thank you very, very much. I don't know how to answer you, but thanks is very small word. The way you explain to us, that give us such a wonderful knowledge, which we go to got a really lots of profit for this knowledge. And only say when you come to Holland, let us know NIA. NIA always welcome you in Holland, our very well-honored person. And last but not least, thank you all the guests to join today this event. And my personal thanks as a president to Mr. Eric NIA. He really make efforts to organize this event. And our Excellency, Mr. Eric NIA, thank you very much. And our Vice President, Suman Koronov, and our Secretary, Mr. Victor von Bailat, and Pankaj Treja, thank you for your all organized Zoom meeting and all your action for this. And Mr. Depal Singh and Shanti Pala Singh, thank you to my board, and thank you to all of you. And I'm really honored. Thank you very, very much. I only say God bless to all of you. Bring lots of love and happiness. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Peter again. Thank you, Mr. Mayank Vahia. Thank you once again. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Eric NIA. Thank you, all the board members. Thank you, and all the guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
God bless everyone. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See you next time.
Okay, bye-bye.
Have a nice weekend.
Have a nice
Very
weekend.
fruitful weekend. God bless. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pankaj. Thank you very much.